That pile of scrap wood you call a foundation is in direct violation of Municipal Code 17, subsection B, Mr. Davis, and I am authorized by the covenants, conditions, and restrictions of this homeowners association to have it dismantled at your expense, which I assure you will be considerable. Karen's voice, a grating mix of saccharine condescension and iron-fisted authority, cut through the crisp autumn air. She stood on the edge of my property line, a portly woman whose floral print blouse seemed to be losing a desperate battle against her midsection, clipboard clutched to her chest like a holy shield. Beside her, a man with a weathered face and a contractor's polo shirt looked deeply uncomfortable, his eyes darting from the concrete footings of my new workshop to the neatly stacked piles of lumber, then to me. He knew, just by looking at the rebar grid and the depth of the pour, that this was no pile of scrap wood. This was the beginning of a structure built to last a century, and it was being built by a man who knew exactly what he was doing. I wiped the sweat from my brow with the back of a gloved hand, my gaze steady. I didn't look at her. I looked past her, at the quiet suburban street, at the manicured lawns and identical mailboxes she lorded over, a petty queen in her kingdom of beige siding. For 3 years I had watched her, documented her, and waited. I knew this day would come. I had in fact engineered it. She mistook my silence for weakness, a common error people made when faced with a quiet man. "Did you hear me?" she chirped, taking a bold step onto my lawn. Her sensible shoes sinking slightly into the turf I kept precisely 2.5 inches high, a regulation she had once measured with a ruler. "This project is unapproved, illegal, and it stops now. It stops. I've already put a lien on your property for anticipated demolition costs and non-compliance fines." That was it, the move I had been waiting for. The final, fatal overreach. If you've ever had your peace shattered by a power-tripping tyrant with a clipboard, or if you believe a person's home should be their castle, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I want to hear your own HOA nightmares in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from so we can all see how far this particular brand of insanity spreads. You see, Karen thought she was swatting a fly, but she had just kicked a hornet's nest that had been silently growing for 1,095 days, and I had a detailed flight plan for every single hornet. This whole war didn't start with a workshop or a lien. It started 3 years earlier with a single blade of grass and a misplaced sense of superiority that was about to cost her everything. It all began the way most nightmares do, quietly, with the promise of a dream. After 25 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, I retired as a lieutenant colonel. My wife, Sarah, had passed from a sudden illness 2 years prior, and the sprawling farmhouse we had planned to grow old in felt less like a home and more like a museum of a future that would never happen. So I sold it, along with most of our things, keeping only what truly mattered: my father's old tools, Sarah's collection of antique botanical prints, and a half-restored 1967 Chris Craft Corsair that sat shrink-wrapped in a storage unit, a project my dad and I had started before he died. I found a house in what seemed like the perfect neighborhood, Oak Creek Meadows. It was quiet, clean, with mature trees and a strong sense of community, or so the realtor claimed. The house itself was modest, but it had a large private backyard, a blank canvas where I envisioned building the workshop I'd always wanted, a place to finally finish that boat and maybe, just maybe, find a new sense of purpose. I closed on a Tuesday and spent the first week meticulously unpacking, finding a place for every memory. I was hanging Sarah's favorite print, a detailed rendering of a Japanese maple, in the hallway when I found the first letter tucked into my mail slot. It was printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock, embossed with the Oak Creek Meadows HOA logo. It was a "Welcome to the Neighborhood" letter, followed immediately by a formal notice of violation. My lawn, according to their official measurement, exceeded the maximum allowable height of 3 inches in several places. The violation cited a specific patch near the driveway that had reached a shocking 3¼ inches. I was given 48 hours to rectify the overgrowth or face a $50 fine. I stood there, in my empty new house, holding a piece of paper that fined me for the grass that was growing when I bought the place. I remember a small, humorless laugh escaping my lips. I was a man who had overseen the construction of airfields in the middle of deserts and managed billion-dollar infrastructure projects under constant threat, and I was being reprimanded for a quarter-inch of grass. I mowed the lawn that afternoon, setting my mower to exactly 2.5 inches. Then I took the violation notice, dated it, and filed it in a new, empty folder labeled simply HOA. It was a habit from my military career. Document everything. You never know when you'll need a paper trail. That was my first introduction to Karen Miller, the HOA president, a name signed with an ostentatious, looping flourish at the bottom of the letter. My second introduction came a week later. She appeared at my door, a thick binder in her arms, her smile as wide and artificial as a department store mannequin's. She was there to personally welcome me and provide a copy of the CC and RS. "We're so thrilled to have you, Mr. Davis," she said, her eyes scanning past me, cataloging the interior of my foyer. "We run a tight ship here in Oak Creek. It's why our property values are the highest in the county." She tapped the binder. "Everything you need to know is in here. We find that clear rules make for happy neighbors." Over the next few months, I learned that Karen's definition of happy neighbors meant silent, compliant neighbors. The violations continued, each one more pedantic than the last. My garbage cans, placed neatly on the side of the house behind a lattice screen I had installed, were apparently visible from a specific angle on the street, if one were to stand on the opposite curb and lean precariously into the road. Fine, $75. I moved them into the garage. Then came the issue of my front door. It was painted a tasteful, deep navy blue, the same color it was when I bought the house. A month after I moved in, I received a notice that navy blue was not on the approved palette of 28 shades of beige, taupe, and off-white. I was ordered to repaint it within 30 days or face a daily fine of $20. I wrote a polite letter back pointing out that the door was this color when the house was sold, implying HOA approval at the time of the previous owner. Her response was a second, more aggressive letter stating that prior oversights did not constitute current approval. I repainted the door to a shade called Desert Sand. I took a picture of the paint can, the receipt, and the freshly painted door and filed it all away. It was during this time I started to notice the pattern. The houses of the other board members were immaculate, yet seemed to have little flourishes that were technically against the rules. A decorative flag here, a non-standard garden gnome there. But the violation notices only ever seemed to land on the doorsteps of a select few. There was the Martinez family, a young couple with 2 small children who were constantly being fined for their kids' toys being left in the front yard for more than an hour. There was Mr. Henderson, a retiree who was cited because the oil stain on his driveway from his meticulously maintained classic car was a half-inch larger than the allowable 12-inch diameter. And there was Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow in her 80s, whose beautiful prize-winning rose bushes were a constant source of Karen's ire. They were too tall, too fragrant, or attracted too many bees. Karen was a predator, and she preyed on those she perceived as unable or unwilling to fight back, the young, the old, the busy. I was none of those things. I was patient. I continued to comply, to document, to build my file. I took walks around the neighborhood every evening, exchanging pleasantries with my neighbors. I listened more than I talked. I learned that Karen had been president for 10 years, running unopposed every time. Her husband had passed away years ago, and the HOA seemed to have become her entire life, her personal fiefdom. She had a small, loyal clique on the board who rubber-stamped her every decree. Dissent was not tolerated. Those who had tried to speak up at meetings were shouted down, buried in procedural nonsense, and then targeted with a relentless barrage of violations until they either gave up or moved away. I was just another nail she was determined to hammer down. But she had no idea, not yet, that I wasn't a nail. I was a screw, and the more she tried to hammer me, the deeper I would set myself until it was impossible to get me out. My second year in Oak Creek Meadows was a masterclass in bureaucratic warfare. Karen, having failed to break my spirit with trivialities, escalated her campaign. It was no longer about simple rule enforcement. It was about demonstrating power. The notices became more frequent, the reasoning more absurd. I received a violation for having a non-conforming satellite dish. I didn't have a satellite dish. The object in question was a weather station I use for my gardening hobby, a small anemometer and rain gauge mounted on a pole in my backyard, completely invisible from the street. I sent a letter with a photograph, explaining what it was. The response was a $100 fine for an unapproved structure and a demand for its removal. I paid the fine, took down the weather station, and documented the exchange. The check was photocopied, the letters scanned, the photos time-stamped. My HOA folder was now a 2-inch binder, meticulously organized by date and violation number. Every interaction with Karen was an exercise in extreme self-control. She would speak to me with a cloying sweetness that barely masked the venom beneath, always calling me Mr. Davis, in a tone that suggested I was a naughty schoolboy. I, in turn, remained unfailingly polite, my voice calm and measured, my responses brief and to the point. This, I learned, infuriated her more than any argument could. My compliance was a form of defiance. By following her insane rules to the letter, I was robbing her of the satisfaction of a confrontation. I was a gray rock, offering no emotional reaction for her to feed on, but behind the placid exterior, a cold, calculated anger was taking root. This wasn't about a weather station or the color of a door. This was about a bully using a thin veneer of authority to torment people for sport. It was an abuse of power, plain and simple. And if there was one thing my military career had taught me, it was how to dismantle unjust power structures from the inside out. I began my reconnaissance in earnest. I attended every single monthly HOA meeting, sitting in the back, observing. The meetings were a farce. Karen would steamroll through the agenda, her loyal board members, a trio of retirees I mentally nicknamed Mo, Larry, and Curly, nodding in agreement to her every pronouncement. Any resident who dared to question a budget item or a new rule was met with a barrage of procedural jargon. "That's not on the agenda," Karen would snap. "You need to submit a motion in writing 30 days in advance." Or, "We'll take that under advisement," which was her code for "I'm going to ignore you completely." It was here I saw the true victims of her reign. I saw the Martinezes, a young couple, try to appeal a $500 fine for their children's portable basketball hoop, which had been left at the curb for pickup by a charity. They had the email from the charity confirming the pickup time, but Karen dismissed it. The hoop was in public view for more than the allowed 2 hours, she declared, banging her gavel. The fine stands. I watched the hope drain from their faces. They were saving for their kids' college. $500 was a significant blow. After the meeting, I approached them in the parking lot. "I'm Mark Davis," I said, extending a hand. "I live on Chestnut Lane. I saw what happened in there. It wasn't right." At first, they were hesitant, conditioned to fear spies and snitches. But something in my demeanor must have reassured them. "It's always like this, mister," Martinez said, his voice tight with frustration. "We can't afford to fight her, and we can't afford to move." I gave him my number. "I've been keeping records," I said quietly, "of everything. If you have any of your violation notices, any correspondence, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me see them." A week later, he dropped off a shoebox full of paper at my door. It was a heartbreaking collection of petty tyrannies. Fines for sidewalk chalk, fines for a discolored patch of lawn during a drought. Fines for a holiday wreath left up 2 days after the January 15th deadline. I scanned every single document into my growing digital archive. My next ally was Mrs. Gable. I found her one afternoon in her garden, her small, gnarled hands gently tending to her roses. She looked defeated. A new violation notice was sticking out of her mailbox. "She says they're encroaching on the sidewalk," she told me, her voice trembling slightly. "She wants me to cut back my prize-winning peace roses, says they're a hazard." I looked at the bushes. The nearest branch was a good 2 feet from the pavement. "She's just being cruel," Mrs. Gable whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "My late husband George planted these for me." I spent the next hour with her not talking about the HOA, but about George and her life and her garden. I learned she was on a fixed income, and the constant stream of fines was causing her immense stress. She, too, had a box of Karen's letters. I took them home, and the pattern became undeniable. Karen was systematically targeting the vulnerable. She used the fines not just for control, but as a revenue stream. Where was all that money going? The neighborhood's shared amenities were in a state of slow decline. The community pool's plaster was cracked, the tennis court nets were frayed, and the landscaping in the common areas was patchy at best. The official budget, which Karen presented as a single-page summary at the annual meeting, was opaque, with huge, unexplained figures under headings like general maintenance and administrative costs. I submitted a formal written request for a detailed financial statement, including all vendor contracts and payment records, as was my right under the state's property laws and the HOA's own bylaws. The official response from Karen was a letter stating that my request was unduly burdensome and not made in good faith. She was stonewalling, and that's when I knew. This wasn't just about power anymore, this was about money. My quiet investigation had just turned into a forensic audit. The binder on my shelf was no longer just a record of harassment, it was evidence. And I was just getting started. The beginning of the 3rd year marked a shift in my strategy. Passive documentation was no longer enough. It was time to go on the offensive, albeit a quiet, methodical one. My target was the HOA's finances, the source of Karen's power and, I suspected, her illicit enrichment. Her refusal to provide detailed financial records was not just a red flag, it was a declaration of war. She had unwittingly confirmed my suspicions and given me a legal foothold. I consulted a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Jessica Riley, who specialized in property law and had a reputation for eviscerating corrupt HOA boards. I didn't want to sue, not yet. That was a blunt instrument. I needed a scalpel. I explained the situation, my 3 years of meticulous documentation, the stories from the Martinezes and Mrs. Gable, and Karen's refusal to open the books. Jessica's eyes lit up. "She denied a formal request for financial records? In writing?" she asked, a predatory grin spreading across her face. "Oh, this is good. This is very, very good. That's a statutory violation right there. We can compel discovery." But I held up a hand. "Not yet," I said. "A lawsuit will put her on the defensive. She'll lawyer up, hide the records, and drag it out for years. I want to get the evidence before she knows we're looking for it." My plan was more subtle. It was time to build my workshop. This project would be the centerpiece of my operation, a Trojan horse built of concrete and steel. For months I worked on the plans. As a retired Corps of Engineers officer, I treated it like a military construction project. The design was flawless, exceeding every county and city building code. The blueprints were architectural grade, detailed down to the last fastener. I planned a 1,500 square foot structure at the far end of my half-acre lot, perfectly positioned to be unobtrusive to my neighbors, but large enough to house the Chris Craft and a full suite of woodworking tools. Crucially, I read the HOA's architectural guidelines, all 200 pages of them, multiple times. I designed the workshop to comply with every single solitary rule, from the pitch of the roof to the color of the siding, a delightful shade of greige from the approved palette, to the type of shrubs I would plant around the foundation. I submitted my complete application packet to the city and county first. Within 6 weeks, I had all my permits in hand, stamped and approved. Then, and only then, did I prepare the package for the Oak Creek Meadows Architectural Review Committee, which was, of course, chaired by Karen. I made 2 copies of the entire submission: the complete blueprints, the material lists, the color swatches, the landscaping plan, and copies of all the municipal permits. I sent 1 packet via certified mail, return receipt requested, to the official HOA address. The other I hand-delivered to Karen's house with a dated cover letter and had her sign a form I had drafted acknowledging receipt. She was smug, assuming she had me. "This is a very significant project, Mr. Davis," she said, barely glancing at the thick roll of blueprints. "It will require a great deal of review." I just smiled. "I look forward to the committee's timely feedback." I knew about the clause. Buried on page 147 of the CC&Rs was Article 9, Section 4, failure of the Architectural Review Committee to issue a written approval or denial of a submitted plan within 60 days of receipt of all required documentation shall constitute an automatic approval of said plan. It was a standard clause designed to prevent a board from pocket vetoing projects by simply ignoring them. But Karen, in her arrogance, had likely forgotten it or assumed no one else would ever find it. The clock started. Day after day, week after week, I waited. I received no calls, no emails, no letters. I could see Karen watching my house from her window across the street. She was enjoying this, letting me twist in the wind. On day 32, I received a letter. It wasn't a denial. It was a request for more information. The committee requires clarification on the proposed guttering material. Please resubmit with specific manufacturer part numbers. It was a classic stalling tactic. I had the information delivered to her house within the hour, again getting a signed receipt. The clock, however, had not reset. The original 60-day window was still ticking. On day 58, 2 days before the deadline, I saw her talking with the other board members on her driveway. They were laughing. They thought they had me trapped in bureaucratic limbo forever. On the morning of day 61, I made a phone call. By 8 a.m., a concrete truck was rumbling down Chestnut Lane. The excavation crew I had on standby began digging the footings. The construction of my workshop had begun. I knew it would be a declaration of open war. I knew it would draw her out. I spent that day working alongside the crew, measuring forms, checking levels. I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I was building something again. But it wasn't just a workshop. It was a trap. A carefully constructed, legally sound concrete and rebar trap. And Karen was walking toward it, clipboard in hand, a furious scowl on her face, completely oblivious to the fact that she wasn't the one in control anymore. The confrontation was inevitable, and I was ready. My binder sat on my kitchen table, tabs in place, waiting for its moment. The war of paper was about to become a war of action, and I had all the ammunition I needed. The moment the first shovel hit the dirt, it was like I had sounded a battle horn only Karen could hear. It took her less than an hour. Her car, a pristine white Lexus that was always, I noted, parked perfectly centered in her driveway, screeched to a halt at the curb in front of my house. She heaved herself out of the driver's seat, her face a mask of incandescent rage. This was not the smug, condescending Karen of the HOA meetings. This was a woman whose absolute authority had been openly defied, and she was not accustomed to it. "What do you think you are doing?" she shrieked, her voice carrying across the quiet street. Neighbors' curtains twitched. This was exactly what I wanted. A public spectacle. I calmly walked over from the excavation site, stripping off my work gloves. "Good morning, Karen," I said, my voice even. "I'm building my workshop, the plans for which were automatically approved 3 days ago per Article 9, Section 4 of the CC&Rs. I had the section and paragraph number memorized. I knew she wouldn't know it. She sputtered, her face turning a shade of purple that was definitely not on the approved color palette. "Automatic approval, that's not a thing. I requested more information. You can't just start building." "I provided the information you requested on the same day, as you'll recall," I said, gesturing toward the folder I had anticipated needing and brought outside with me. "Your 60-day review period expired at midnight on Tuesday. It's now Friday. The project is approved." I opened the folder and showed her the signed, dated receipt for the initial submission and the second signed receipt for the guttering information. The certified mail return receipt was clipped right on top. Her eyes bulged. She was a master of using rules to trap others, but she never imagined someone would use her own rule book against her. For a moment she was speechless. But a creature like Karen doesn't back down. She doubles down. This is This is a misinterpretation of the bylaws, she stammered. I am the president, and I am ordering you to cease all construction immediately. This is an illegal structure. The construction crew had paused, looking uncertainly between us. I gave the foreman a slight nod. Keep working, I said, my voice firm. All our permits are in order. The foreman, a grizzled man named Sal, who I had briefed on the potential for an HOA-related incident, shrugged and signaled to his men. The sound of machinery starting up again was music to my ears. It was the sound of Karen's authority crumbling. This public loss of control sent her over the edge. She pulled out her phone, her thumb jabbing at the screen. That's it! I'm calling the police! I'm reporting an illegal build and a hostile homeowner! This was the move, the escalation I had counted on. Bringing in outside authorities was a fatal error for her because, unlike the HOA board, the police operate on facts and laws, not whims and grudges. While she was on the phone spinning a dramatic tale to the 911 dispatcher about my aggression and flagrant disregard for the law, I went back inside and retrieved the master binder. It was heavy, nearly 5 inches thick, with color-coded tabs for every category of evidence: my violations, neighbor testimony, financial request, architectural submission, and a new section I had recently added titled Potential Criminal Activity. By the time 2 police cruisers rolled silently up to the curb, I was standing calmly on my front porch, the binder resting on the railing. Karen rushed toward the first officer, a tall, weary-looking sergeant named Miller. No relation, I hoped. "Thank God you're here, officer," she gushed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "This man is building an illegal structure on his property. He's refused to stop. He's been aggressive and threatening. He's a menace to this entire community." Sergeant Miller listened patiently, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to me. "Sir, can you tell me what's going on here?" "Certainly, Sergeant," I said calmly. "My name is Mark Davis. I am a retired lieutenant colonel from the Army Corps of Engineers. I'm building a workshop on my property. I have all the required permits from the city and county, which I'd be happy to show you." I opened the binder to the Architectural Submission tab and produced the official stamped permits. The sergeant took them, his eyes scanning the documents. He recognized them for what they were: legitimate legal authorizations. "These look to be in order," he said, handing them back. Karen was practically vibrating with fury. "But the HOA hasn't approved it. It's against our rules." The officer turned to her. "Ma'am, the HOA is a civil agreement. This is a legally permitted construction. We can't stop him from building on his own property if he has the city's permission." "But he's hostile," she insisted, playing her last card. "I feel threatened." The sergeant looked at me, standing perfectly still on my porch, then back at her, a woman who was red-faced and shouting in the middle of the street. "Ma'am, the only person I see acting in a hostile manner right now is you," he said, his voice laced with impatience. "You need to lower your voice. This is a civil matter. If you have a dispute with Mr. Davis, you'll have to take it to court. Now, unless there is a real crime being committed, I'd advise you to go home and let these men do their work." It was a public and complete repudiation of her authority. The neighbors who had been watching from their windows were now stepping out onto their porches. They saw Karen, the neighborhood tyrant, being dressed down by a police officer on the very street she ruled. They saw me, the quiet man she had been tormenting, standing firm and vindicated. Karen stood there, utterly defeated, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. The officers got back in their cars and drove away. The sound of the concrete mixer churning felt like a victory drum. She shot me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, a look that promised retribution. Then she turned and stomped back to her Lexus. As she drove away, I knew the war had entered its final, most dangerous phase. She had been publicly humiliated, and a narcissist like her would never forgive or forget. She would come after me with everything she had. What she didn't know was that I was counting on it. Her rage would make her sloppy, and I was anything but. The failed police confrontation was the crack in the dam. For 3 years, Karen had ruled through fear and intimidation, creating an atmosphere where neighbors were afraid to even talk to each other, lest a friendly conversation be reported as a conspiracy. My public defiance and the subsequent validation by law enforcement changed the emotional weather of Oak Creek Meadows. The fear began to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity. That evening, my doorbell rang. It was Mr. Martinez. The young father Karen had fined into submission over a basketball hoop. He was holding a six-pack of beer and had an uncertain look on his face. "Mr. Davis." "Mark," he said, "I saw what happened today. I've never seen anyone stand up to her like that. My wife and I, we just wanted to say thank you." I invited him in. We sat at my kitchen table, the HOA binder lying between us like a centerpiece. I opened a beer for each of us. "She's a bully, and bullies only have as much power as you give them," I said simply. He nodded, his eyes on the binder. "You mentioned you were keeping records. Is that all of it?" I opened the binder to the tab labeled Neighbor Testimony and showed him the file I had created for his family containing the scans of the shoebox of violations he had given me. His eyes widened as he saw the sheer volume of harassment, all organized, dated, and cross-referenced. "I've been fighting a quiet war," I explained, "but I can't win it alone. Her power comes from isolating us. Our power will come from uniting." He was quiet for a long time, just looking at the pages. "There are others," he finally said, his voice low. "The Hendersons with the classic car. The Lees, who got fined because their kid's swing set was made of cedar instead of pressure-treated pine. People are scared, but after today, maybe they're more angry than scared." He left that night with a new sense of resolve. He became my lieutenant. He started talking to the other families Karen had targeted, the younger residents who felt trapped and powerless. He'd meet them at the park or at the grocery store, away from the prying eyes of Karen's loyalists. He'd tell them about me, about the binder, about the possibility of fighting back. A few days later, Gable came over carrying a freshly baked apple pie. Her hands were no longer trembling. There was a spark in her 80-year-old eyes I hadn't seen before. "Mark," she said, setting the pie on the counter, "that officer, he put her in her place. I haven't slept so well in years." She then handed me a thick manila envelope. I went through my records. George, my husband, he was the treasurer for the HOA board about 12 years ago before he got sick, before Karen took over completely. He kept everything. Inside the envelope were old budget reports, meeting minutes, and vendor contracts from over a decade ago. It was a financial snapshot of the HOA before Karen's reign. I spent the entire weekend cross-referencing these old documents with the paltry single-page budget summaries Karen had been providing at the annual meetings. The differences were staggering. 12 years ago, the landscaping contract for the common areas was $25,000 a year. Karen's current budget listed grounds maintenance at $95,000. The pool service contract was $8,000. Now it was $40,000 under the line item Aquatic Facilities Management. The total budget had nearly tripled, yet the services had visibly deteriorated. The money was going somewhere, and it wasn't back into the community. Armed with Mrs. Gable's historical data, I escalated my financial investigation. I used a public records database that I had a subscription to for my consulting days. I started with the vendors. Karen's budget didn't list company names, just categories, but I had a hunch. I remembered seeing the same landscaping truck around the neighborhood for years. Evergreen Solutions, LLC. A quick search revealed that Evergreen Solutions, LLC was registered to an address in a neighboring town. A search of property records for that address showed it was owned by a man named Frank Kowalski. Another search on a social media site cross-referencing Karen's maiden name, which I had found on a public genealogy website, gave me the final piece. Frank Kowalski was Karen Miller's brother-in-law. I felt a jolt of ice-cold certainty. This was it. I dug deeper. The pool companies, Crystal Clear Pool Services, and the general repair company, Handy Helpers Inc., were also registered to LLCs. With a little more work, I found that both LLCs were part of a C corporation, K Group Enterprises. The registered agent for K Group Enterprises? Karen's sister, Mary Kowalski. Karen wasn't just a bully, she was running a criminal enterprise. She was using her position as HOA president to award inflated no-bid contracts to her family members, funneling our dues into their pockets. The constant predatory fines weren't just about control. They were a necessary revenue stream to cover the costs of her embezzlement and make the budget seem plausible. The reason she fought so hard to keep the books closed was that they were a detailed record of her crimes. She had placed a lien on my property for a fake infraction. I wondered how many others she had done this to. I called Mr. Martinez. I need to know if Karen has ever put a lien on anyone's house for unpaid fines. He said he'd ask around. 2 days later, he called me back, his voice grim. Mrs. Gable, he said. She was too ashamed to tell anyone. Karen put a lien on her house 6 months ago for over $5,000 in accumulated fines for her rose bushes. She's been trying to pay it down, but with the late fees and interest Karen tacks on, the balance just keeps going up. She's terrified she's going to lose her home. That was the moment my cold, calculated anger turned white hot. This woman was threatening to make an elderly widow homeless over a garden. The war was no longer just about justice. It was about rescue. My workshop foundation was fully cured. The framing was scheduled to go up the next day. But my focus had shifted. The workshop was the battlefield I had chosen, but the real war was for the soul of the community and the safety of my neighbors. Karen thought this was about a shed. She had no idea I was about to dismantle her entire crooked kingdom piece by piece. The revelation about the lien on Mrs. Gable's home was the point of no return. Karen had crossed a line from petty tyranny into outright predatory villainy. This was no longer a game of bureaucratic chess. It was a rescue mission. The first thing I did was visit Mrs. Gable, bringing my binder and a thermos of hot tea. I found her in her living room surrounded by piles of threatening letters from an attorney's office, an attorney, I would soon discover, who was paid for by the HOA to harass residents on Karen's behalf. Miss Gable was in tears, convinced she was about to lose the home she'd lived in for 50 years. He's threatening foreclosure, Mark, she sobbed, holding up a letter filled with menacing legal jargon. I don't have that kind of money. I sat down with her and spoke in the calmest, most reassuring voice I could muster. Evelyn, I said, using her first name for the first time, you are not going to lose your house. I give you my word. This ends now. I explained to her in simple terms what I had discovered about Karen's financial dealings, about the family contracts, about the embezzlement. I explained that the lien, based on fraudulent and excessive fines, was illegal. We're not just going to fight this, Evelyn, I told her, my voice hard as steel. We're going to use it to bring her down. I immediately called my lawyer, Jessica Riley. I laid out the new evidence, the network of family-owned LLCs, the grossly inflated contracts, the clear pattern of bid rigging and embezzlement, and now, the fraudulent lien on an elderly woman's home. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mark, Jessica said, her voice devoid of its usual sarcastic humor. This is big. This is felony-level stuff. We've moved past civil litigation and into the realm of the district attorney. We're talking about racketeering, wire fraud, mail fraud, embezzlement. I know, I said, and I have the proof. We arranged to meet the next day. I spent the rest of the evening compiling everything into a new separate binder, this one labeled Criminal Complaint. I printed out the corporate registration documents for Evergreen Solutions, Crystal Clear Pool Services, and K Group Enterprises. I printed the property records linking the addresses to Karen's family. I created a spreadsheet comparing the pre-Karen vendor costs from Mrs. Gable's old records with Karen's current inflated budget numbers, showing a discrepancy of over $500,000 over her 10-year presidency. I included a detailed timeline of the harassment against Mrs. Gable, culminating in the lien. When I met Jessica at her office, she had cleared her entire afternoon. We spread the documents across her massive conference table. For 2 hours, she went through every page, her expression growing more grim and more excited with each document she reviewed. She cross-referenced corporate filings on her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She got sloppy, Jessica murmured, pointing to a document. The articles of incorporation for her sister's company. Karen is listed as a founding board member. She resigned 2 months before she became HOA president. But the original filing is still in the state's public archives. She directly helped create a company that she would later award six-figure no-bid contracts to. This is the smoking gun, Mark. This connects her directly to the fraud, not just through family ties. My strategy had been to build a case so airtight that Karen couldn't escape. Jessica's job was to weaponize it. Okay, she said, leaning back in her chair. Here's the plan. We're going to make a formal presentation to the Economic Crimes Unit at the DA's office, not just a call, a full-blown, undeniable dossier. But we don't do that yet. First, we turn up the heat and force her to make another mistake. Jessica's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. First, she would file an emergency motion in civil court to have the lien against Mrs. Gable's property declared void and seek a temporary restraining order against Karen and the HOA, barring them from any contact with Mrs. Gable, citing elder abuse and predatory lending practices. This would put Karen on the legal defensive, forcing her to hire a lawyer for a case she couldn't possibly win, and it would immediately protect Mrs. Gable. Second, while Karen was distracted by the lawsuit, we would mobilize the community. According to the bylaws you gave me, Jessica said, tapping the thick document, a special meeting of the membership can be called with a petition signed by just 25% of the homeowners. How many homes are in Oak Creek? 200, I said, so we need 50 signatures. We're going to call a special meeting, Jessica declared, a predatory glint in her eye, and the agenda will have one item, a vote to recall the entire board of directors and elect an interim board pending a full forensic audit of the HOA's finances. The petition was our new focus. Mr. Martinez and I divided up the neighborhood map. Armed with a simple one-page summary of the situation, carefully vetted by Jessica to avoid any hint of libel, we went door to door. We didn't lead with the criminal accusations. We led with the things everyone could see. The decaying tennis courts, the exorbitant dues, the endless petty fines. We spoke of transparency and fairness. The response was overwhelming. The seeds of discontent I had seen at the HOA meetings had blossomed into a forest of anger. People were tired of being afraid. They were tired of paying more for less. In 2 days, we had 94 signatures, nearly half the households in the neighborhood. We formally submitted the petition to the HOA board, legally compelling them to schedule the meeting within 30 days. Karen was now fighting a war on two fronts. A personal lawsuit from Mrs. Gable that threatened to expose her predatory practices, and a community-wide rebellion that threatened to strip her of her power. Her reaction was exactly as we'd predicted, panicked and irrational. She sent out a hysterical, typo-riddled email to the entire community, accusing me of being a disgruntled troublemaker, leading a campaign of lies and slander to destroy the neighborhood. She claimed I was trying to take over so I could build an industrial complex in my backyard. The email was so unhinged, so transparently self-serving, that it had the opposite of its intended effect. It convinced the undecided that we were right. She had taken the bait. She was flailing, making mistakes, and exposing her true nature to everyone. The date was set for the special meeting. The community center was booked. Jessica had already given the DA's office a courtesy heads-up that a significant criminal referral was coming their way and that a public meeting with the subject of that referral was imminent. The trap was set. All the pieces were in place. All that was left was for Karen to walk into the room and watch as the world she had built on lies and fear came crashing down around her. The night of the special meeting, the air in the Oak Creek Community Center was thick with a tension I hadn't felt since my deployments. It was a mix of anger, anxiety, and a fragile, burgeoning hope. The room, which usually held a dozen apathetic residents for Karen's monthly meetings, was filled to capacity. Every one of the 150 chairs was taken, and people were standing along the back and side walls. Mr. Martinez stood near the entrance, greeting people, a quiet confidence about him. Mrs. Gable sat in the front row, flanked by her 2 adult children who had driven in from out of state. She looked serene, the fear gone from her eyes, replaced by a steely resolve. I stood near the side, running a final check on the projector and laptop I had set up. Everything was ready. Karen and her 3 bored cronies, Mo, Larry, and Curly, sat at a long table at the front of the room, looking out at the crowd with a mixture of shock and disdain. They had expected a small group of my supporters, not a full-blown popular uprising. Karen, dressed in a severe black pantsuit that seemed to amplify her funereal mood, clutched her gavel like a weapon. She looked cornered, which made her dangerous. She opened the meeting by attempting to seize control through procedure. "This special meeting has been called under dubious pretenses," she began, her voice straining to sound authoritative. "Before we proceed to the single, misguided agenda item, I want to open the floor to a discussion on the recent spate of malicious gossip and property damage in our community." A man from the back shouted, "Just get on with it, Karen. We're here to vote." The room erupted in applause. Karen's face flushed. She banged the gavel. "Order! I will have order." But she had already lost the room. According to the bylaws, as the petitioner who called the meeting, I had the right to speak first. I walked to the podium, my steps echoing in the suddenly silent room. I placed my master binder on the lectern. It landed with a solid, satisfying thud. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice calm and clear, amplified by the small PA system. "My name is Mark Davis. For 3 years, I, like many of you, have been a resident of Oak Creek Meadows. And for 3 years, I have watched the principles of fairness and community erode under the current leadership of this board. I didn't start with the money. I started with the people. I want to talk about the purpose of an HOA. It is to maintain community standards and protect property values for the benefit of all residents. It is not meant to be a weapon used by one person to harass their neighbors. It is not meant to be a tool to fine a young family," I said, gesturing to the Martinezes, "for their children's sidewalk chalk art. It is not meant to fine a man for a spot of oil on his own driveway, and it is certainly not meant to persecute an 80-year-old widow," I said, my voice rising with controlled anger, "and threaten her with foreclosure over the placement of her rose bushes." I clicked the remote for the projector. The first image that appeared on the screen behind Karen was a photo of the violation notice Mrs. Gable had received for her roses. Then a photo of the roses themselves, a good 2 feet from the sidewalk. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. I then put up a slide showing a dozen different violation notices I had personally received, for everything from my grass being a 1/4 inch too tall to my unapproved weather station. I showed them the pictures, the dates, the fines. I was laying the foundation, brick by brick, of a clear pattern of abuse. Karen tried to interrupt. "This is out of order. This is slander. These are confidential records." "These are my records, Karen," I stated firmly, "and I am choosing to share them. As for order, the bylaws state that the floor is mine." I then moved to the next phase. This pattern of harassment isn't just about control. It's about funding a system of gross financial mismanagement. For years, we have been given a 1-page budget summary with no detail, while our dues have skyrocketed and our community assets have fallen into disrepair. On the screen, I projected the budget summary from the last annual meeting. It showed the line item, grounds maintenance, $95,000. Then I projected the contract from 12 years ago, from Mrs. Gable's records. Landscaping contract, $25,000. "Our dues for landscaping have increased by almost 400%, I said, letting the number hang in the air. So I decided to ask a simple question. Who are we paying? The answer is a company called Evergreen Solutions, LLC. The next slide showed the corporate filing for Evergreen Solutions, registered agent, Frank Kowalski. "And who is Frank Kowalski?" I paused, letting the tension build. "He is Karen Miller's brother-in-law." The room exploded. Shouts of "thief" and "resign" echoed off the walls. Karen was on her feet, screaming, "Lies! These are all lies! My family has nothing to do with this." Then perhaps you can explain this, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. I clicked to the final damning slide. It was the original incorporation document for K Group Enterprises, the parent company of all the vendors. And there, listed clear as day as a founding board member, was the name Karen Miller. The room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. You could hear a pin drop. Karen stared at the screen, her face ashen. She looked like she had been physically struck. All the bluster, all the rage drained out of her. She knew she was caught. This, I said, my voice low and resonant, is racketeering. This is embezzlement. This is a deliberate, years-long scheme to defraud every single person in this room. At that exact moment, as if on cue, two figures detached themselves from the back wall and began walking slowly and deliberately down the center aisle. They were a man and a woman, dressed in plain business attire. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. They walked right up to the front table, their expressions grim and professional. The man held up a badge. "Karen Miller," he said, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable weight of the law. "I'm Detective Morrison with the District Attorney's Economic Crimes Unit. We have a warrant to seize all financial records, computers, and communications related to the Oak Creek Meadows Homeowners Association, pending an investigation into multiple felonies, including embezzlement and fraud." The woman, his partner, handed a thick document to Karen's trembling hand. She didn't even look at it. She just stared at the detective, her mouth agape. Then her eyes met mine across the room. In that moment, she finally understood. This wasn't about a workshop. It wasn't about a fine. It was about a long overdue reckoning she had brought entirely upon herself. She had mistaken my patience for weakness, my silence for submission. And now, in front of the entire community she had terrorized, her corrupt kingdom was being dismantled by the very laws she had twisted for her own gain. The appearance of the detectives from the DA's office shattered the last vestiges of Karen's authority. The room, which had been a tinderbox of raw emotion, was now hushed, watching a slow-motion demolition. Karen, who had built her identity on being in control, stood utterly powerless as Detective Morrison calmly explained that they would be accompanying her to her home, which doubled as the HOA's official office, to execute the warrant. Her three board cronies, Mo, Larry, and Curly, looked at each other in panic, slowly pushing their chairs away from her as if her corruption were contagious. They were rats deserting a sinking ship, but the warrant covered the entire board's communications. Their escape was an illusion. Jessica Riley, my lawyer, who had been standing discreetly near the back, stepped forward. "In light of these developments," she announced, her voice ringing with authority, "I believe proceeding with the agenda item is in order. We will now hold the vote for the recall of the entire current board of directors of the Oak Creek Meadows HOA." There was no debate, there was no discussion. The vote was a formality, a catharsis. One by one, homeowners stood to cast their voice vote. The ayes were a deafening chorus of liberation. When the call for nays came, the silence was absolute. Karen and her board were removed by a unanimous vote. The next order of business was to elect an interim board to manage the HOA's affairs, cooperate with the investigation, and schedule a proper election. Mr. Martinez stood up. "I nominate Mark Davis as interim president." The nomination was seconded by a dozen voices at once. The vote was, again, unanimous. I stood there, looking out at the faces of my neighbors, faces I had come to know over 3 years of quiet observation and careful alliance building. I saw relief. I saw hope. And I saw a community that had been fractured by fear beginning to stitch itself back together. "I accept," I said simply. "My first act as interim president will be to place an immediate moratorium on all pending fines and violations. My second will be to authorize a full independent forensic audit of the last 10 years of this association's finances. My third, I said, looking directly at Mrs. Gable, who was weeping with joy, is to state for the public record that the lien against the Gable property is fraudulent, void, and will be immediately and permanently removed. The cheer that went up in the room was thunderous. It was the sound of justice. As the meeting adjourned and people began to file out, talking excitedly, shaking my hand, clapping me on the back, I watched as the detectives escorted a pale and silent Karen out of the community center. She didn't look at me again. She couldn't. Her power was gone. Her public face was shattered, and her future was a grim landscape of lawyers and courtrooms. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. As interim president, I, along with a newly elected interim board composed of Mr. Martinez, Mr. Henderson, the classic car owner, and a sharp accountant who lived on the next street, began the arduous process of untangling Karen's web. We hired an external forensic accounting firm. Their initial report confirmed everything I had suspected and more. The embezzlement was estimated to be in excess of $700,000 over 10 years. Karen had not only awarded contracts to her family, but had also created fake invoices for services never rendered, paid for personal expenses like car repairs and vacations with the HOA debit card, and maintained a secret slush fund filled with fine money that never appeared on the official books. The legal battle was swift and brutal for her. Faced with the mountain of evidence from my binder and the forensic audit, Karen's case was hopeless. The DA charged her with multiple counts of felony embezzlement, grand larceny, and conspiracy. Her sister and brother-in-law were also indicted as co-conspirators. To avoid a longer prison sentence, Karen took a plea deal. She was sentenced to 4 years in state prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. Her family members received lesser sentences, but were also on the hook for restitution. The court placed a lien on her house, her precious Lexus, and all her assets to begin paying back the money she had stolen. The day she was sentenced, I wasn't in the courtroom. I was in my newly completed workshop. The final coat of polyurethane was drying on the floor. The space was filled with light, smelling of sawdust and fresh paint. My father's tools were arranged neatly on the wall, and the hull of the 1967 Chris Craft Corsair sat in the center of the room, waiting patiently. I had spent the last few months working on the framing, the wiring, the insulation, building something real and lasting with my own hands. It was my sanctuary, a testament to a battle fought and won. I stood at the large window that overlooked my backyard and beyond it, the neighborhood. I could see the Martinez kids playing on their new city-approved and now HOA unbothered swing set. I could see the brilliant, defiant blooms of Mrs. Gable's prize-winning roses, which she had let grow as tall and as fragrant as they pleased. The community pool was closed for a major renovation, paid for by the first down payment of the restitution funds. A new reputable landscaping company was resodding the common areas. The change was palpable. The fear was gone. People smiled at each other on the street. Neighbors were having barbecues again. The community was healing. I had moved to Oak Creek Meadows seeking peace, and in the end, I had to go to war to find it. But it wasn't just my peace I had fought for. It was everyone's. I picked up a small framed photo from my workbench. It was of Sarah, her smile radiant, taken on a lake during a summer trip years ago. "We did it," I whispered. I had built my fortress, not to keep the world out, but to protect the small part of it I had come to call home. The long fight was over, the documentation was filed away. The quiet man had won the quiet war, and the silence that now settled over the neighborhood was not one of fear, but of genuine, hard-won peace. The aftermath of Karen's downfall was as significant as the event itself. With the old board gone and the interim board in place, our first priority was triage and transparency. We held weekly town halls in the community center, not as a formality, but as a necessity. The projector screen that had once displayed Karen's fraudulent financials now showed our progress. We presented the forensic auditor's findings in excruciating detail, ensuring every resident understood the depth of the betrayal. We showed them exactly where their money had gone and the legal steps we were taking to claw it back. There was anger, of course, but it was a productive anger channeled into rebuilding. We established new ironclad financial controls. All expenditures over $500 required 3 competitive bids and approval from the full board, with the bids made public to the homeowners. All financial records were digitized and made available through a secure online portal accessible to every resident. We were building a system so transparent that a person like Karen could never take root in it again. The process of reversing Karen's reign of terror was painstaking. We went through every single fine she had issued over the past 2 years. With the help of Jessica Riley, who was now the HOA's official counsel, we determined that over 90% of them were illegitimate, issued without proper evidence, or for infractions of rules that Karen had simply invented. We issued refunds to dozens of families, including a full reimbursement of over $2,000 to the Martinezes. It was a symbolic and practical gesture that did more to restore faith in the HOA than anything else. My role as interim president was demanding, but it was work I found surprisingly fulfilling. My experience in the Corps of Engineers, managing complex projects and navigating bureaucracy, was perfectly suited to the task of rebuilding a broken organization. We rewrote the architectural guidelines, simplifying them and removing the ambiguous petty clauses Karen had used as weapons. The new rules were based on common sense. They focused on safety, structural integrity, and maintaining a cohesive aesthetic without dictating the precise shade of beige for a resident's front door. We wanted to encourage pride of ownership, not enforce oppressive conformity. One of my proudest moments came during a board meeting about 3 months after the takeover. Mrs. Gable, who had been appointed to a newly created community garden committee, gave a presentation. She proposed using a neglected common area to build a communal vegetable garden where residents could rent small plots. She had a full plan, complete with a budget for soil and irrigation, and a waiting list of 30 families who wanted to participate. The board approved it unanimously. Watching her, so full of life and purpose, a respected leader in the community she almost lost, was a greater victory than seeing Karen in handcuffs. The workshop became my haven. In the evenings, after long hours spent on HOA business, I would retreat to its quiet, orderly space. The work on my father's Chris-Craft was slow but steady. Sanding the old mahogany hull, feeling the smooth grain emerge from beneath decades of old varnish, was a form of meditation. It was a process of restoration, both for the boat and for me. Each piece I repaired, each coat of varnish I applied, felt like I was healing a small part of my own past, preparing for a future I was finally ready to embrace. The community itself was transforming. The oppressive quiet of Karen's rule was replaced by the sounds of life. Kids laughing, the buzz of lawnmowers on a Saturday morning at heights of their owners' choosing within reason, the murmur of conversations between neighbors over fences. The annual neighborhood block party, which had been a stilted, awkward affair under Karen, was resurrected as a massive potluck barbecue. I stood by the grill, flipping burgers, watching as Mr. Henderson proudly showed off his classic car to a group of teenagers, and the Martinez family laid out a picnic blanket next to a family I didn't even recognize. We were not just residents sharing a zip code anymore. We were a community. News of Karen's spectacular downfall spread to neighboring communities. I was invited to speak at a few other HOA meetings where residents were dealing with their own versions of Karen. I never went as a conquering hero. I went as a fellow homeowner, sharing my story and the simple tools I had used: documentation, persistence, and community. I shared our new, transparent bylaws and financial controls. I was planting seeds, hoping to arm others with the knowledge to defend their own communities from the petty tyrants who sought to rule them. 6 months after the special meeting, we held a formal election for the new permanent HOA board. I ran for president, not out of a desire for power, but out of a sense of duty to see the job through. I was elected again with an overwhelming majority. My new board was made up of capable, honest people who cared about the neighborhood. The era of the HOA as a weapon was officially over. It was now what it was always supposed to be: a tool for the collective good. My life had found a new, unexpected rhythm. I was a leader again, but not of soldiers. I was the steward of a neighborhood, a guardian of the peace I had fought so hard to win. My fight with Karen had started as a personal battle for my own property and dignity, but it had become something much larger. It was a story about the abuse of power and the courage of ordinary people to stand up to it. It was about the fact that no one is too small to be a tyrant, but also that no tyrant is too powerful to be brought down by a united, determined community. The documentation, the planning, the alliances, it had all been worth it. The justice we achieved was not just for us, but for anyone who has ever been made to feel powerless in their own home. One crisp Saturday morning, about a year after the recall meeting, I was putting the final touches on the Chris Craft. The hull gleamed with 15 coats of marine varnish, the chrome fittings polished to a mirror shine. The engine had been rebuilt, and the interior was newly upholstered. It was beautiful, a piece of history brought back to life. My workshop doors were wide open, and the smell of sawdust and varnish mingled with the scent of freshly cut grass from a nearby lawn. Mr. Martinez stopped by, his young daughter perched on his shoulders. "She's a beauty, Mark," he said, admiring the boat. "When's the maiden voyage?" "Next weekend, Birkin," I said, unable to hide my pride. "Lakefront Park. You and the family should come." "We wouldn't miss it," he replied. His daughter waved at me, and I smiled back. Her childhood would be free of nonsensical fines for playing outside, a small but significant victory. Later that day, Mrs. Gable dropped off a basket from the community garden filled with ripe tomatoes, zucchini, and herbs. "For your celebration," she said, beaming. "The garden is producing so much, we're donating the excess to the local food bank." Her committee had turned a patch of weeds into a source of pride and charity for the entire neighborhood. The change was everywhere. Property values, Karen's supposed justification for her tyranny, had actually increased by 10% since her removal. It turned out that people were willing to pay a premium for a neighborhood that was not only well-maintained but also sane and friendly. The new lower HOA dues, we had been able to cut them by 15% after securing reasonable contracts with reputable vendors, certainly didn't hurt either. The story of Karen became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered at real estate closings. She was released from prison after serving 30 months of her 4-year sentence, having earned time off for good behavior. I heard through the grapevine that she had sold her house, the sale forced to cover the last of her restitution payments, and moved in with her sister in another state. Her name was erased from the community, but her legacy served as a permanent reminder of how quickly power can corrupt when left unchecked. We instituted a permanent bylaw review committee, a rotating panel of residents tasked with reviewing our governing documents annually to ensure they remained fair, clear, and relevant. We were inoculating ourselves against future Karens. The day of the boat launch was perfect. The sun was bright, the water was calm. A crowd of about 50 people from the neighborhood had gathered at the boat ramp at Lakefront Park. The Martinezes were there, the Hendersons, the Lees, and dozens of others. It felt less like a boat launch and more like a family reunion. With the help of Mr. Martinez and Mr. Henderson, I backed the trailer down the ramp. The Chris Craft slid gracefully into the water, floating perfectly. I climbed aboard, turned the key, and the rebuilt engine roared to life with a deep, satisfying rumble. A cheer went up from the shore. I took the boat for a slow victory lap around the cove, the wake spreading out behind me like a banner. I thought about the journey, the initial anger at the injustice, the years of patient documentation, the forging of alliances, the thrill of the final confrontation, and the quiet satisfaction of the aftermath. I had fought for my workshop, for my right to build something for myself. But in doing so, I had helped rebuild a community. I looked at the shore, at my friends and neighbors, at the tangible proof that our fight had been worthwhile. I thought of Sarah and how she would have loved this. She had always been the one who brought people together. Maybe in my own way, I had finally learned how to do that too. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a golden glow across the water, I felt a profound sense of peace. It was the peace that comes not from the absence of conflict, but from the triumph of justice. The war was over, the boat was finished, and I was finally home. The quiet of the lake, the hum of the engine, the distant laughter from the shore. It was a perfect ending and a perfect new beginning. I opened the throttle, and the Corsair surged forward, skimming across the water, leaving the past in its wake and heading toward the open water of the future. The fight had been long and arduous, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most important structures we build are not made of wood and steel, but of trust, unity, and a shared resolve to stand up for what is right. And that is a foundation that no bully, no matter how powerful they seem, can ever hope to break.